And over these next 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about congregationalism, which, if you didn't know, we are a congregational church. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history, the polity, which basically means how do we self-organize as a community of faith, and the theology. But we're not just doing this to say, hey, here's what it looks like in all times and all places. Because one of the beautiful things about being church, mostly beautiful, right, with all of its own complexity, and one of the true things of congregationalism is an affirmation that each unique congregation is made different by the members, by the people who are a part of the community, and by our collective work of discerning the Spirit's invitation to us in this time. And so why we named it How We Church is because that's part of what we're working out together, is how we want to church, what it means to be church, one with another. So just a thank you for being here today, and a couple things of overview, and then I will move us to a space of prayer as we gather, because that is one of the things that the church does. So tonight we're going to talk a little bit more about the history of congregationalism, and I will just say, is there anyone who in person who has not received a handout packet? Okay. Just to say, if you are with us online and you're watching this, you'll be able within a few minutes to be able to access in the comments a PDF of everything that we're going to be going through for tonight. So if you're in person and you know someone, they'll be able to find this PDF, so will you. After this time as well. So tonight we're going to be talking about some of the history of congregationalism, some of our own history. We'll be sharing and reflecting a little bit about our own stories, and we'll have some space as well for wrap up and closing prayer. So I wanted to start us here as we move into a space of prayer as we gather. This is from John Robinson, a Congregationalist, and it's on the quilt you cannot see that we have hidden away right now. It's this beautiful quilt that has part of this quote about how there is more light to break forth. But from John Robinson's farewell sermon, he noted there is more truth and light to break forth out of God's holy word. And it's a sense that's at the heart of congregationalism, is that God's Spirit is always unfolding more of what it means to be people of faith in our time and our place. And so the prayer that I wanted to start us with is actually the words from a hymn connected to this sermon. So I invite you, if you want to read along or listen along with your eyes closed, however you want to pray, hear, receive these. We limit not the truth of God to our poor reach of mind, by notions of our day and sect, crude, partial, and confined. Now let a new and better hope within our hearts be stirred. The Lord hath yet more light and truth to break forth from his word. Who dares to bind by their dull sense the oracles of heaven, for all the nations, tongues, and climes, and all the ages given. The universe, how much unknown, the ocean unexplored. The Lord hath yet more light and truth to break forth from his word. Darkling our great forefathers went the first steps of the way. 'Twas but the dawning yet to grow into the perfect day. And grow it shall our glorious sun more fervid rays afford. The Lord hath yet more light and truth to break forth from his word. The valleys pass, ascending still, our souls would higher climb, and look down from supernatural heights on all the bygone times. Upward we press, the air is clear, and the sphere music heard. The Lord hath yet more light and truth to break forth from his word. O Father, Son, and Spirit, send us increase from above. Enlarge, expand all Christian hearts to comprehend thy love. And make us all go on to know, with nobler powers conferred, that you, O Lord, have more light and truth to break forth from your word. Amen. Well, with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff. As we ground ourselves in the history of Congregationalism, we're going to take some time to think about our own stories and history.
What a wonderful prayer to begin with as we talk about Congregationalism. I'm just going to warn you, I was sitting there before and I put my soda down. That whole table in front of you is going to be soaking wet. Sorry about that. That's on me. Sorry about that. We as Congregationalists are a covenant group of people. We come together because we make promises to each other, and we listen to each other's promises, and we take each other at their word, and we say, okay, let's, with those promises, move forward together, seeing what God might do in us and through us. We make promises that we're going to show up to the best of our ability. We're going to show up in a way that we are trusting that God's going to show up and be a part of what we do together. And in that covenant, we create what is happening in the life of this church. A part of that is us showing up in our best selves, showing up in the best ways that we can. And we do that because we all show up with our stories. We are products of who has been a part of our lives, the places we have been, the things that we have done. And so our story is really important, and that story that we bring. I always say at New Member Sundays that as we listen to the new members join the community with their covenant, and we say that covenant together, is that now we are a different congregation. We are a very different congregation now that those folks have joined us. Why? Because now it's your perspective, your ideas, your thoughts that have now mixed with ours. And we believe that collectively that's how God's going to lead. So your stories, the way that you show up is very important. We want to give you a chance to think about maybe if you see there's some green sheets in front of you, you can use that if you want to write something down, or you can just ponder by looking at the screen that's here. We are not going to be able to do this with everybody tonight, so we're going to spread this out over the next, including tonight, the next 3 sessions. So we're going to get a chance to kind of ponder, what are 4 of the big significant events that have happened in your life? They don't have to be necessarily spiritual or religious. They could just be 4 that have helped shape who you are. The first is going to be your birthday, so you're going to be mindful of that, and I'm excited about that because I just had my 65th birthday on Sunday, so I'm a little bit mindful of that. Of course, you were born, and the gift that is, that you have life and all of what that can mean. And we're grateful that you were born as well, because now we get to know you and get to know your story and get to do life with you as much as we are able. So, looking at that, your birthday, and then 4 significant events. Think about that, hold on to that, and then we're going to give a handful of you a chance to share with the rest of us what's 1 or 2 or 3, if you want to share all, if we have time, what some of those events were in your life that have helped shape and mold you into the people that you are. Here's why we do this. Not because it's really fun to put people on the spot and embarrass you, because it is. But it's more a chance for us to, to take a little bit of that risk to say, you know what, I'm going to share a little of my life. Because in doing that, I give permission to others then to share their life with me as well. And then together, as we share those stories, then we begin to mix those stories together. We all grow together. So take about 2 minutes just to ponder that for a minute. If you want to use that green sheet and write it down, you can do that. Otherwise, you can just ponder them yourself. Take 1 more minute. Usually when I have groups do this, I oftentimes will start with whoever has the birthday closest to today. And mine was on Sunday the 17th. Does anyone have closer to today? All right, then I'll start. I was born in 1958, which makes me 65. I don't want to hear anything more about Medicare. That's okay. Significant event, I was the last of 3 children in my family, born in Seattle, Washington. One of the events was that we moved from that, which all of us knew and understood, and we moved to Minnesota when I was just going into middle school, which was a very significant event because it was a very traumatic move for all of us, except for my dad, who got up every day and had something to do. And that's in terms of who our friends were and where we were going to go to church and all the things that we needed to do in order to establish ourselves. That was a very significant event for myself and for my family. 1979, when I realized I was not going to be a police officer, but I was going into ministry in some form or fashion. That was another significant event because all that I had been planning on since I was in 5th grade all the way up to my sophomore year in college was heading in one direction, and God had a different plan. In 1983, I married my wife. That was 40 years ago this summer. Was significant because out of that, our marriage and our relationship, we had 2 wonderful kids, and now we have 6 grandkids. And so if you know all about that, if some of you are looking might have some idea of what that is. That's pretty amazing. And then I would say the other significant event was it'll be 4 years this February when I was made senior minister, and what that meant in terms of a church that I had served for 35 years at that point, to continue my work and to continue my life of ministry with you all and this team that's here. So, who else was born in September? Anybody else born in September? You were? You want to go next? Will you go next?
Okay, first of all, when you're as old as I am, there need to be about 45 more lines on this piece of paper. I was born September 11th, which now, oh, my name is Sally Mannard, and I've been here forever. So, anyway, that's significant right there. Yeah. I was born 9/11, which of course wasn't so significant then, except that it was my birthday, but now it's even more significant. And I was born in Elgin, Illinois, and and I married Elgin. So don't you think? I mean, so there's a big.
What is even the possibilities of that?
But I think I fast forwarded actually to when we were married and living in Interlachen Park, which was just this wonderful neighborhood to raise a family in, and the friends that we had, many of them still here, that are just wonderful. But then Young Life and this church and all the things that brought for our faith and for us. But then it was Faith Fitness Fellowship. It was a major thing. It really helped transform my faith and my life. I think having to prepare for little sermonettes develops your own faith. So I recommend.
So you do aerobics for a while, and then while your heart's racing, your heart's beating on your chest, you sit down and have a devotion.
We did.
It was amazing.
Yes, it was very fun. Jane Fonda had nothing on us. We were leg warmers and leotards, anyway. Anyway, I think that's enough. But anyway, there are many significant events, definitely family in my life. So,
how about first week in October? Anybody first week of October? Second week of October? Oh, there you go. Oh, you got your own mic.
Yeah. I got born I was born on October 3rd, 1971. I think the first thing I had, I had to pencil in a fifth one. So the first one
doesn't surprise me.
It was probably one of the most traumatic things that I would say happened early in my life was my parents' divorce. And that probably propelled me in so many different directions. Till the second thing that really happened was in college, I met Jesus for the first time. So
Well,
That happened in December 6th, 1990. So I was one of those kind of Christians where it's like, you know the day. And then the next one I had was meeting and marrying my wife, Julie. We met on accident, basically. We both wound up going to a church party that neither of us wanted to be at. And she argued with me the entire night. But she decided maybe she might be able to hang out with me because I could dance at least. So that was cool.
and we
I could talk theology, religion, but I could dance.
We could all pay money to see that.
That's
Actually.
yeah. It wasn't breakdancing. I'd given that up by that point. Then I'd say the birth of both of my boys were huge. Partly because of that connection to my parents and the lack, kind of my father not there, not sure if I was ready to be a father, all those kind of things, and just how your kids grow you up is such a big part of my own story. And then obviously the loss of my son, Jonah. So,
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else the first week of October? The second week of October? The third week of... Nobody else in October? Okay. First week in November. Wow. Were we all born in January? We'll go back to August. We'll go back to August.
all right.
They got a mic right there. Let's go right there. Thank you for volunteering. It's like at an auction. Don't move. Don't even move.
I'd be so grateful.
Moving 3,000 miles when I was 12, from New Jersey to Seattle.
What's your name?
I have a name, Kathy Pinsky.
Yes, thank you.
And then I would have to say the next significant thing was my dad signed me up for karate lessons when I was 17 because I had to learn how to take care of myself since I was going to go away to college, 30 minutes away. But the gift is I decided to accept a job offer and move to Minneapolis. And what I knew is I didn't know anybody, so I joined a karate school because I knew that that way I would have a community. And that's where I met my husband. So that was marriage. And then I didn't want to have kids, but we'd have a daughter who's 25. And so that's significant. And then right now, I just got really clear of the opportunity that I get to create something different with my life. And it's kind of scary. I'm not so sure how to go about it. So that's going to be another transformation step for me.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Kathy. We're going to have time for just a couple more. So I think we were up to the third week in November. Fourth week in November. There we go. We got two of those. There we go. There you go, Bill.
Hey, so I'm Bill Walker. I'm a relatively new church member, but we've been going here for a while since my daughter was born. I was born November 25th, so middle, late November, 1976. I'm from inner city New York, and that was kind of a big part of, I wanted out of inner city New York, so that was kind of a big part of my story. So the ones I picked, I went to youth group when I was in middle school at my church, and that was really big for me. I kind of grew up in the church, but sort of menza, not real committed. And I had a youth group leader that was just really great, and that's when I would really say, like, I became a Christian with a big C. And through that, I met our youth pastor, who was fantastic, and he left us to go to Gordon College in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts is not New York, and And I really liked Mike, so I was like, I'm gonna go visit him and see Gordon College in Massachusetts. And I decided to go there. And so that was my second thing. Gordon was huge for me, really life-changing in a lot of different ways. I just got back from a weekend with a couple of guys from school, so we, real good college connections. When I was in Massachusetts, I met my wife, Amy. We were both working for the Park Service at the time. I used to be a park ranger. If you work for the Park Service, you move around a lot. Our last station was the Virgin Islands, which you think would be great, but it's not. It's crazy hot down there. And she's from Minnesota. That didn't go well. So she moved us here, and in 2011, my daughter was born. So that's the fourth one. My daughter, Maddie, who normally is attending youth group, in part because that was such a big part for me, but she's not here tonight. So those are my four.
I saw somebody else moving over here. Was there somebody else in November? Yep. Nobody? Art, is it your birthday in November? No. Anybody? How about the first week in December? Somebody was born in the first week in December. Holy mess. Second week of December. Third week of December. Oh, there we go. You got it? Well, how about just born? Is that what you said? What was your date of your birth?
Hi there, I'm Christy Hoekstra. We've been coming for about a year and deciding to take the plunge and become members. I would say I am 10 and 8 years younger than both of my older siblings, and so I had two sets of parents growing up, and I was heartbroken when they both graduated and went off to college. So that was kind of I became a third child to an only child for the last 10 years growing up, and that kind of changed how I saw the world. I would say when I went to college, I went on to Iowa, University of Iowa, which was 5 hours away from Mankato, where I grew up. And I kind of felt independence for the first time. Nothing traumatic, nothing beautiful. It was a different phase of my life. And I would say the third and fourth events kind of happened at the same time. We met 5 years ago, and Corey has 3 kids. And so I became a wife and an instant stepmom to 3 at the same time. And anyone who has kids knows how much work 3 kids is. So I'm still trying to figure that one out. But yeah, it was a lot. And really just kind of appreciate the community that you guys have here, and we want to be part of it. So
Fabulous. Thank you. Anybody Christmas birthday? Okay, we'll do 2 more and then we'll be done. Start with Jeff.
Jeff Pope.
Remember what you said, because we'll come back next 2 weeks.
Actually, I was born on December 20th, and people say, well, did you get cheated at Christmas time? And actually, in the family that I was in, I probably got extra at Christmas time because nobody wanted me to feel cheated, okay? I'm just going to real quickly mention a couple of things. I went all the way back to when I was born, because as I look back, the loving family that I was born into was a great nurturing place to grow up in that I finally realized. My first year in high school, the first day in high school, I met Suzanne, who was in my social studies class. I didn't wise up that I wanted to ask her out until like my junior year, but
Sounds about right.
but we do have a history that I think goes back about 68 years to 1955. And then in 1959, I graduated from high school and got a nice scholarship to Northwestern and went on from there. So those will be my main events.
And so many others. Thank you. Don, you have a December birthday? Awesome.
Hi, I'm Don Cook. My birthday is December 22nd. As I look at the events that I consider life-changing, past birth, the first one would have been when I got married, and that was a little coincidental because in college we had an English teacher that seated us alphabetically, and Betty's maiden name is Doberstein. Cook came next, and that's how I met her. The second one would be life change, and I'd say would be the birth of our two sons, 4 years after we got married, and 7. And then the last life changing would be the death of our younger son, Adam, 25 years ago.
Well, that's awesome. The next couple of weeks, we'll have an opportunity for others to share a bit of their story. And again, as we listen to each other's stories, we each become even more human to each other. We become more real, live human beings that we get a chance to think about and see the places where we overlap, see the places where we're different, and the richness that relationships then bring to each of our lives and to the life of this church. So thanks for sharing. It felt, I'm sure, a little bit that you were on the spot. Hopefully, if you had a birthday in there and you didn't want to share, you just acted like it wasn't your birthday. So, some of you have been through a new members class in the last 5 years, and you have seen this already. But even if you've seen this before, you're going to enjoy this next 10 minutes. This is one of the great events that happens in the life of this church a few times each year, and it's Sarah giving the history of Christianity, the Christian church, pre-Reformation in less than 10 minutes.
No, I'm gonna do more like 3.
Oh, it's going to be miraculous then.
Yeah.
All right, so.
Yeah, so hang tight, and then we'll back clean up with the historical theologian so he can fix everything that I get wrong. So tonight, as we ground ourselves a little bit in our story, and as we're thinking about, I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Congregationalism, want to bring you a little bit more into the history of the life of the church in general. Ready? Okay. All right. So in your handouts, you have one that's more legible that has a little bit of what's going on. So basically, right, Christianity finds its roots in Judaism, and the early church is birthed in Jesus. And for quite a while, there's actually one church in all the different places that it exists. And through that time, though, there ends up being a schism that happens in the church. There's disagreements, shocking, in human history around what God wants of us and asks from us. And the big split that happens is between the East and the West. There's also the church that is developing in Africa that is also reflected, but I'm following the one that's traces to the lineage of Congregationalism, okay? So from there's different efforts and kind of bubblings up of the Spirit, and this is one of the things I would say about Congregationalism, is that from the tradition we're from, it's a deep sense of belief that God's Spirit is continually at work and bubbling up and moving amongst people in the midst of human history. And so a big thing that happens in any of the movement and evolution of the church is it happens in time. Things are happening politically, advances in science and technology, and new learnings and more light and truth that's breaking forth. And so what happens is you have the advent of the printing press. You have more people who are able to read. There's knowledge that's being uncovered and unearthed for folks, and there ends up being a reformation that happens. Very simply put, right? In one sense. And so through that, as there's continued reformation that happens, one of the major movements that happens is in the Lutheran Church, what becomes the Lutheran Church in Germany. Martin Luther will celebrate Reformation Sunday at the end of October as a congregation. That is the birth of Protestantism that happens. But in that, then there's more reform that happens, and people being like, wait a minute. The Lutheran Church is really connected to the state. And people have concerns about that. There's all sorts of different movements that are bubbling up within that. And through that, there ends up being a major kind of break that happens between the Lutheran and the Reformed traditions. Christian can fill all of that in. And then basically, the Reformation, that spirit continues and unfolds. And what we see happen is that, anybody seen the musical Six? Okay, me 4 times, but musical Six, highly recommended. It is on Broadway. And it is about Henry VIII's 6 wives, right? And so part of then God works in mysterious ways too, including through men who have some issues. And there is the birth of Anglicanism in England. And it's moving away from saying that the Pope is over all of the church in England, but it's broader movements of spirit that's also happening. But then what happens is folks say, wait a minute, if you've ever seen The Crown or know how England works, right? The head of England is also the head of the Anglican Church. And some folks have some issues with that. And so there's people who are working for reform within the church, and then there's people who separate out from the church. And through that, we end up having the birth of Congregationalism that is connected. There's the Puritans who end up in the United States. You may have heard about that before. And that basically is the tradition that birthed Congregationalism. There are a lot of congregational churches, especially in Eastern United States. You may have heard of this little thing called the Boston Tea Party, right? That got voted on in the Congregational Church building, right? That was at the Congregational churches when they did that. So there's this birth that happens there of Congregationalism, which Christian's going to tell you more of the explicit history about it. But I just wanted to say that there is a whole worldwide movement of Christianity, and we are but one branch representing that, wrestling with what it means to follow the Spirit in our time. I think that was actually like 4.5 minutes, so I'm sorry. The end. Bye.
I think that deserves a round of applause. That was a lot of history. That was like 1,600 years in like 3 minutes. I just so that you know, disclaimer, I had a class of 15 weeks on Congregationalism that I've tried to condense into the next 20 minutes. So here we go. Yes, actually I should probably pull up my proper 19 and a half, that's right, I'm losing time. So what I'm going to do basically is kind of piggybacking on that is just talk to you a little bit about the highlights of the congregational tradition. And one of the reasons for doing this is, as I say here and on your outline, that definitely the picture that I'm going to paint for you, certainly of the early Congregationalists, very different in some ways than the way that we do Congregationalism. But that doesn't mean that we're not in dialogue with that tradition. We're always in dialogue, I think, with our histories. So even though people, institutions, traditions change, it doesn't mean that you leave behind the history. So it's worth knowing about that, knowing where you come from, even if you're no longer precisely what you were all those many years ago. So that's sort of the goal here. And what I really want to do then is kind of highlight, I think, sort of 4 or 5 moments, and I've tried to group them around time periods. Basically, the history story of Congregationalism kind of starts in the late 1590s or so, 1500s. And then we have essentially, 4 centuries after that, basically. So I'm trying to highlight each of those centuries, big dynamics. Some of those dynamics, which I think actually inform who we are and how we do attempt uniquely to live out our congregational commitments. So the first thing that you may not know is that this church and this tradition is a form of radical Christianity. It basically begins as a revolt against the state church in England. So if I remember one time telling a Baptist that they were, that the tradition of the Baptists was that they were radicals, and this person was like, my God, I grew up conservative. I can't handle being called a radical. So and she was definitely Southern, so because I'm Southern, and I remember that conversation. But essentially, Congregationalism comes into being, or it's sort of a kind of ethos that's happening as the English state church, which we will sometimes in the United States either call Anglicanism or Episcopalianism, as that's coming into being, there are people that are saying, hey, you're not going far enough. You're not reforming the church enough, number one. And number two, we don't think the monarch or even the political authorities should have as much say in how we live out our faith. So that's really, in some ways, the rub that our tradition essentially revolts against. I mentioned up here that it's part of the dissenting movement, which includes a bunch of other movements. So if you're familiar with Mennonite churches or Quaker churches or the early English Baptists, as well as a bunch of other really interesting and kooky people like the Diggers and the Levelers and the Ranters, et cetera, et cetera. We won't go into all that, but so they were hanging out with crazy folks, basically. What was the vision? The vision was that the church should be a more leveled reality. It should not be centralized, and it should not be organized according to a hierarchy. So as I mentioned here in the outline, the church, rather than the crown, should have authority over how it lives its life. Back in those days, and actually even today, if you were a part of the Episcopal Church, the head of that church is the King of England. That is not the case, of course, in our tradition. And not only do we not have a king or a queen, we don't even have bishops. So we felt that even having bishops was problematic. So during this time when they're making this argument, of course, they had the temerity to argue that even the queen should actually probably be obedient to the ministers and the word of God. And you know, Queen Elizabeth was not happy about that. From the very beginning, the question about how the church was going to organize itself and how power was actually going to function in the church, because it's fine if you want to get rid of the hierarchy, but decisions still have to be made, and you have to decide who you're going to be, how you're going to do the Lord's Supper, what you're going to spend your money on, et cetera. So all those decisions, they don't go away. So the question of how are we going to make those decisions together, that really becomes a central part of the life and one of the major dynamics in the history, in part because they never settle the issue. So even today, if you're wondering how exactly do things work, it's because we don't quite know ourselves. We're still figuring it out, right? It's a negotiation. And that's in some ways, that's one of the things that makes, I think, our tradition really interesting, is it really is a living history. We're working out how we share power together, authority, whatever that may be, together on the ground. We don't have a set model that we're necessarily beholden to. So that constant question, where does power reside and how is it going to be negotiated, that is there throughout, from the very beginning all the way up to today. How much power do members of the council have? We have a church council here with a moderator. In other traditions, that might be called a board of elders. How much power do they have to make decisions on behalf of the congregation? Should the lay people in the congregation, should they vote on every single issue? Or are they electing people to take care of some of the business, et cetera? Those are the kinds of questions that we're talking about. And there's a lot of diversity on how different churches answer this question. And I think this gets back to Sarah's point, which is there basically are as many different congregationalisms as there are congregational churches, right? So whatever we decide together, that's kind of how we're going to operate. And that's where I think also Jeff's comment about this being a covenant community. Covenant is even more sort of primal than our congregational commitment. Why? Because when we make a covenant, we're basically binding ourselves to one another. We're saying we're committed to each other. And then we're going to work out some of these other questions on top of that. So early on, the basic vision of the church, and this is kind of what's going on in England. In just a minute, I'll talk a little bit about the move to Holland and then North America, but we're still sort of in the late 16th, early 17th century. The idea is that a local congregation should basically be free to make decisions about who their pastor's going to be, how they're going to spend their money, how they're going to organize themselves. They should not be dictated to not only by the queen or king, but even by bishops or pastors of other churches. So there's an awful lot of emphasis on local autonomy. The local congregation then understands itself to be bound together by a covenant. We've used this language of covenant. This is Old Testament language, Hebrew language. And it's basically the idea of making a binding promise to someone else and saying that you are committed to them come hell or high water. That's how we would say it where I'm from. So God makes a covenant with the community, and then the community makes a covenant with one another. And then your commitment to that covenant is supposed to be understood to be sealed through baptism. We don't necessarily hold to precisely that, but we do have this idea here of owning the covenant. And that's something that we're also going to be coming back around to as a community in October. They wanted to allow for cooperation among churches. That was very important because It is fine to say we're going to be in charge of ourselves, et cetera, but when you live in the world, you know that sometimes challenges come along that it takes more than just your local community to deal with that. So cooperation, particularly around the area of mission, is very important, but nevertheless, local autonomy is essential. The congregation then was understood essentially to have a say over the things that typically a bishop would have had a say over, or a company of pastors. That's one of the other models that they would have drawn from. And the idea here, right, is to reject the role of the state, the magistrate, to keep the life of the church in shape, et cetera. The congregation is going to oversee things like discipline. We don't do a lot of disciplining here, I don't think. We do sort of Minnesota-style discipline, which is like, you probably shouldn't have done that. Selection of elders and pastors, ordination, reform of worship and practice. Basically everything that you would think of as the business of the church, the congregation needs to be involved either directly or through their elders or members of council. That's kind of the idea in terms of that early vision. Now, when you tell the Queen of England that she is not only not in charge of you, but is actually subject to some of the things that you have to say, she's going to get angry. And that's actually one of the things that happens. And so early on, part of the story of Congregationalists is not just that they're rebels, but that they're persecuted rebels, and that they have experience of prison as a part of their DNA as well. So because of early persecutions, many folks who eventually kind of become kind of our Congregationalist forebears, they wind up fleeing England because of that concern about the state church and state persecution. When they're over in Holland, they're hanging out with all kinds of interesting people, Anabaptists, and I won't go into there, but that's a peace church tradition. They wind up influencing some of these early Congregationalists. The early English Baptists, some of whom are the first in the history of the Western church to argue for something like religious tolerance. They influenced those early Congregationalists. So they're hanging out in Holland, and they eventually decide, we would like to remove ourselves from Holland because things are getting hard here because, agents of the state are coming over. It's just this, was it like 30 miles or something like that across the English Channel? Let's go to this place called North America. And that's what they do. So they are part of the sort of European migration, colonization, and a lot of the bad stuff too. Congregationalists are also bound up in some of that. But they make their way across in the 1620s. And these early folks who make their way across, they are what we know as the Pilgrims. They are the Pilgrim, and there really are two sort of traditions, or kind of, I guess there would be bloodlines traditions within our big tradition. One is the Pilgrim tradition, and the other is the Puritan tradition. The Pilgrim tradition is the one that has the strongest argument for local autonomy. They're so strong that they basically would be called separatists. They don't, not only do they not want to answer to the Queen, they don't even want to talk to the Queen because they don't even think the Church of England is a church. Right? They have no concern for that. The Puritans, on the other hand, think, the Church of England is not all bad, and we can do some things to change it, to reform it. So those two angles, those two sort of tensions of radically pulling ourselves apart, emphasizing our autonomy, our own desire to kind of determine the direction that we're going to go, that's one really strong one. And the other one is, hey, we can still stay in connection with others. We're not just going to be the people set apart and therefore somehow superior to others, which you might be able to argue as a critique of the Pilgrims. So some of them go to Holland, and some of them remain in England. Well, this gives way in the migrations that we're talking about. In the 1620s, the Pilgrims come over. These are the ones that land at Plymouth Rock, which comes to be called the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and they established the first Congregationalist foothold, I suppose we might say, in North America. And John Robinson, whom we've already had quoted, he preaches a sermon. He doesn't actually travel with them, but he preaches a sermon as they leave. And one of the things he says is basically keep your eyes and ears open, because surely there is more light and truth that will come forth from God's word. So he wants them to be open, even though in some ways they're not going to be quite as committed to being open. That is followed then by another wave of migrations that comes particularly out of England, because things get worse and worse in England, and this then is followed, this would be the Puritans. So the Pilgrims leave from Holland, and the Puritans come over from England. And as I mentioned here, between 1630 and 1642, about 20,000 Puritans are going to wind up migrating from England over to Massachusetts Bay. See, these are some of the key names. I'm sure you've heard of all of them. That was a joke. You might have heard of a couple of them. John Winthrop. Some folks would know who John Winthrop is. This is the guy who talks about setting up a city on a hill. He preaches on the Mayflower. Or no, I guess he doesn't preach on the Mayflower, but he is a part of that process. Roger Williams, who is he's the founder of the Baptist tradition in North America. I'm a secret Baptist. And so he's a cool guy. That's all I can say. John Cotton, Thomas Hooker, Anne Hutchinson, a very significant, important figure who winds up getting persecuted by the Puritans because of her beliefs. And then later, others, Richard Mather, Mary Dyer, John Davenport. You don't need to know all these for the final. You'll be fine. You have to read all of their sermons, but it'll be in updated English, I promise. So when they come over, when this large group of folks comes over, there's still sort of the question of how are they going to relate to the English crown, because they're still in a land claimed by the English crown. But they're, 1,500 miles away, so they're at remove. So they have a lot of freedom, in other words, now to figure out what they want to do. And they decide, hey, we want to establish what really this is what is especially associated with John Winthrop, a city on a hill. And what they mean by that is both a civil form of governance as well as a religious way of life. So we're going to establish a civil form of governance that's not going to be as autocratic and as oppressive, this is at least what they say, as what we see back in England. And of course, one that respects our freedom to worship the way that we want. There is a dark side to this, and that is that I used to teach this students at a university where I used to teach, and say that these folks were really interested in religious freedom for themselves, but not for anyone else, right? And that is part of the early history. So what does that mean? Well, what it meant was they said, we are anyone and everyone who comes over to settle in the city of Boston or in the environs around that in the Massachusetts Bay Colony is going to be understood to be a part of a covenant community. And that covenant is both a civil covenant and a religious covenant. The civil covenant means everyone is going to be expected within those boundaries to behave themselves according to kind of a pared down version of the law of Moses, 10 Commandments, something like that. The folks who decide to join the church, they're going to be a part of the religious community. And the benefit of joining the church is that you get to vote on who's going to rule not only the church, but also society. So the only people that could vote were members of the church. Within about 10 years, so 1630 is kind of when this starts, by 1640, 2/3 of the population living in Boston are not members of the church. So you can kind of see where this might be going in terms of the problems that this is going to create. As I mentioned then, because of that, from the very beginning, the Puritan vision of being a covenant community, living uprightly, going to church, having your children baptized, taking off Sabbath, not drinking, not celebrating Christmas. That was another thing. The war on Christmas started with the Puritans, by the way. I think that's kind of funny, but I'm sure O'Reilly would not. That's right, because I'm a Baptist. That's right. From very beginning, folks are going to push back on this. So the attempt to resist what probably would have felt pretty oppressive starts almost from the get-go. And it doesn't just start with folks who aren't members of the church. It also starts with people who are inside of the tradition. And one of the key figures there would be someone like Roger Williams, but also later Ann Hutchinson. And basically their objections are not only civil, but also theological. Like they have certain objections to Puritan doctrine. They have certain objections to the way that baptism is being performed, et cetera. And they wind up either getting driven out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony or eventually driven out and killed. And so Ann Hutchinson is the one in particular who is driven out, and she dies of exposure in the wilderness. Yes. Roger Williams gets driven out, and because he had befriended the local, I think it's the Narragansett tribe, and had learned their language, he is able to abscond down to what we know today as Rhode Island, and he's essentially the person who founds that colony. Another example, though, of the kind of policing that would have happened is something like the Salem witch trials, which you may or may not know. Maybe you watched, a Johnny Depp movie or something with, that had to do with that. That was the only one I could think of. Sleepy Hollow, is that the one? Yeah. Yeah. Well, but it still captures that basic, that basic sensibility. Yeah, the Crucible is actually even better. Right. Yeah, there's great commentary going on in the audience, by the way, for our friends online. Okay, so this is happening, and I would say by about the fourth generation, this entire vision is understood not only by outsiders, but particularly by insiders, that this is untenable. We can't go on being like this. We don't even have the ability to control the population the way we want. There are churches and whole communities that are leaving our fellowships. We need to change. And so you basically can see in the fourth generation, particularly with a figure that some of you may have heard of, a guy named Jonathan Edwards. They start to revise their doctrine and their practice. And some of it has to do with this event that breaks out on the eastern seaboard called the Great Awakening. And the Great Awakening was basically a kind of religious revival. Maybe we might describe it as a revival in the interest in religious things. It sometimes meant that people were converted. At other times, it just means people think that religion and religious practice, maybe it's more important than what they had thought about before. He is very involved in helping the tradition to begin to rethink itself. Slowly but surely, it has to make those changes because we're going to start to transition now from small colonies to a larger entity, right, by the time we get up into the American Revolution. And by that point in time, the Congregationalists are a very small, very, very small portion of the population. So the pragmatics, in some ways, force the tradition to become creative and to adjust to that. One of the things I mentioned here, Congregationalists are very involved in revolutionary politics. And what I mean by that is literally Congregationalist ministers would get up and preach, "It's time to overthrow George," from the pulpit. And they would quote John Locke and others on the liberty of the soul, et cetera. So they're very intimately involved, want to see the country move in a certain direction, very involved actually in the early sort of construction of the democratic experiment that happens in North America. And yet they also realize they can't control this thing, right? This is not their animal. They just want to be a part of it. So we move then into the 19th century and 20th, and I'll kind of put these two together. Basically, the 19th century, for everyone, brings enormous changes, but also for the Congregationalist tradition. The first thing is Congregationalists not only are a minority, but they come to realize it. They come to understand, hey, we're small, and our survival in some ways might be actually at stake. So the intense commitment to local autonomy begins to soften a little bit more, because the only way we're going to survive as a tradition is if we do it together with other churches. So a sense that maybe we need to be have connections more than just to local churches that are Congregationalists, but even broader, maybe the whole state, and God forbid an entire country, right? This idea of being a denomination, in other words, which would have been completely foreign and totally anathema to the early Congregationalists, all of a sudden, it's a live option, right? And the tradition sort of has to think about this. Keeping with their early radical roots is numerous examples of Congregationalism and Congregationalists being involved in some of the major radical social movements in the 19th century. Things like abolitionism, women's rights, prison reform, trying to hold the U.S. government accountable to its treaties that it has signed with native peoples and nations, etc. There are significant numbers of examples, not only of individuals, but even of organizations being started. And of course, our tradition, I think this is something that's a point of pride, or at least something to be thankful for, is the first majority white Protestant denomination to ordain an African American and women. And this happens pretty early in the 19th century. So there's a kind of social progressivism, is what I'm getting at, that's already there in the 19th century. That's not something that comes up in the 20th century. That's something that's there. And if you go back into that early kind of radical protest, you can see where it comes from. The next thing then that I think is also important is the deep, deep commitment to education of our tradition. And we, I'm thankful for this. I'm your teaching minister. And I will say, you will not actually find a lot of teaching ministers at other churches. But in our church, you do have that, because our tradition has a very long commitment to education. Our tradition, of course, is responsible for founding Harvard, for founding Yale, for founding a number of other major and important colleges, universities, seminaries, etc. And I just kind of listed 2 or 3 up there. Oberlin College, I think, is one of the most significant ones in terms of social movements. But Carleton, right down the road here, was founded by Congregationalists. So very involved in that regard, very committed to that. And in some ways, the ways that our tradition has responded to big challenges has almost always included an educational element, that you need to understand the world you live in, you need to be informed in order to be effective, and you don't need to bury your head in the sand. That's not what the Christian faith is about. So that brave new world that I talk about here, because of that commitment to education, our tradition is actually able to weather some of the big controversies that rattle and sometimes destroyed other denominations, like how are we going to engage with Darwin's Origin of the Species, or his book, The Descent of Man? What are we going to do with this whole new way of reading the Bible that talks about the Bible is not just a single book that fell out of heaven, it's actually a set of historical documents? Can we use historical critical methods? Our tradition is on the forefront of being open to that. So I think this is something that is very much worth emphasizing and being proud of. And then moving much more kind of directly into the 20th century, and I do have a little comment here on the kind of piggybacking on some of that social engagement. We also play a role in the social gospel movement. So one of the earliest figures to give birth to the social gospel movement is the Congregationalist pastor, I believe he was in Cincinnati, Washington Gladden. Now, in addition to that, then, the 2, I think, really big impulses in the 20th century, and then I'll be stopping. I think that's enough time, right? I'm sweating bullets, man. We're going to get through this, I guarantee it. Was a sense that Christian churches need to engage one another in true, genuine fellowship. We need to find a way, without downplaying our differences, to actually seeing not only what our similarities are, but the things that we each uniquely have that offer gifts to the wider Christian family. So what is typically called the ecumenical movement. There are Congregationalists who play a major role in seeing things like the National Council of Churches come into being, the World Council of Churches, etc. Some of that is that they are motivated, Douglas Horton in particular is motivated by his experience in World War I, and he believes, hey, one of the only ways we're going to stop warfare is if Christian churches can actually get along with one another. That would be great. So Doug Horton is very much involved in that. And at the same time, this question of learning how to embrace others and we're going to make this journey, if we make it together, leads to a series of mergers. So there are some very small congregational conferences that exist in the late 19th century, and they begin to merge with other churches, like the Methodist Congregationalists merge with the Congregational Church, I think it's the Christian Congregational Churches, I think is what it's called, the 3 Cs. That stuff starts happening, takes about a 30, 40-year period, and there are 3 different mergers, and this is huge. This is like the first time. By the way, there is a very long history of churches breaking apart in the history of Christianity. There is a very, 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 very short period or very short history of churches actually coming together to merge, and our church is one of those churches, or at least our tradition has that. So alongside of that ecumenical impulse then comes the desire we have to have some kind of denominational structures to enable us to navigate and engage the modern world. And the middle of the 20th century really is taken up with negotiating what is that going to look like. And what we wind up with in the United States are 3 major congregational denominations. The first is called the 4 Cs. This is the conservative Congregational Christian Churches. This is the most conservative. It would certainly be, I think, described as a fundamentalist in terms of their theology. They would own that. That group starts in the 1940s with about 15 churches. They've grown a little bit, but they're still relatively small. So the 4 Cs still is in existence. It is by far the smallest, and certainly it is the most conservative. The NACCC and the UCC basically come into existence around the same time. So the NACCC, the National Association of Congregational Christian Churches, and the UCC, the United Church of Christ, are the 2 sort of major expressions of Congregationalism in the U.S. The NACCC, boy, these acronyms are something else. In a way, most of the churches that are a part of that, at least initially, they're part of that denomination, they were very suspicious of what they thought was going to be too much power in the hands of the denomination. So that's why they formed the NACCC. It's about 185 churches. The UCC, which is the largest and is modeled on the Uniting Church in Canada and the Uniting Church in South India, that is by far the largest and is also the most sort of socially and theologically progressive. We have navigated connections with these different denominations, and actually one of the things I discovered when I was teaching my class is that we were involved in some ways in both promoting and rejecting these different denominations. So the history of this actual church and of the city of Minneapolis and Congregationalists here in Minneapolis actually plays a role in the story of the formation of these denominations. That then is the history that we want to, or that I wanted to highlight for you. So 4 major times, right? Rebels, outsiders, who are deeply committed to a vision of Christianity, who don't think that just because someone has political power, they should have power over the church. That's a no-no. We come to New England. Unfortunately, we set up our own system, right, which becomes somewhat exclusionary. But over time, we have to give way to that. And the tradition reaches back into its own creative ability to rethink and re-engage. And that's one of the things that's there all along the way, is a desire somehow to engage. Even if it's engaging by saying no, it still is an attempt to engage. And what do we wind up with? Churches in the 19th century who are making major contributions to justice movements, who are making major contributions to the life of the nation, and who eventually then come together to form denominations to do mission together. So I think that's a pretty good grasp of the history. And I'll turn it over to my colleagues to bring it on home.
Well done. I'm going to switch mics because he got it all sweaty. You want to do it before I wrap up? You'll do the very final. This stuff is evolving, just as good Congregationalists. It's evolving right in front of you. This is good. We have thrown a lot at you. Sarah's history, Christian's overview. We thought it was very important as we were talking about, kind of who we are as Congregationalists, kind of with a group of you who are considering membership in the life of this church, to give you that kind of information, to give you a sense of where we fit in the tree and what that means in terms of who we are and how that's come to be. Of course, as Christian said, we spent weeks. You can spend weeks on this. My polity class that I took in seminary was months long, in terms of us understanding how these things came together and what that meant for us and how we would lead within that polity. But there might be a thing that caught your attention, or a thought that you had where you go, oh, this was really interesting, or I didn't know this before, or I'm wondering more, I'd like to know more about that. Or even a question that you wanted to throw at us that we might be able to spend the last few minutes discussing that. Is there something that bubbled up, or thought that you'd like to express, or question you'd like to ask? Indy. Hold on one second. Mike's coming your way. I gave it back to him. It's not my first day.
Would you say that Congregationalism is also theological liberalism?
I didn't hear the last word.
Theological liberalism?
Certainly has the gamut of theological understanding. One of the things that when I talk about Congregationalism, I talk about them as being, they're not so much denominations as associations. They're associations of like-minded churches that are a part of the 4 Cs, which is conservative. The associations across the country of the NA, National Association, which is more centrist in terms of their theology, and then the UCC, which tends to lean more towards being more liberal. That's not true completely, because there are certainly churches within those associations that would have the gamut of theological understanding. But that's also one of the great things about being in Congregationalism. You can be a part of a body, and you can have that gamut of different ideas and thoughts, as long as it doesn't go against your conscience or go against your understanding. So, and again, it's your association, your willingness to be a part of that covenant community, even recognizing there might be some differences within the same body that you're a part of. So, did you
And
want to add
we'll,
something?
2 things. One is that next session, we'll actually start off talking a little bit more about the history of this congregation. Because this congregation, also like Plymouth Congregational Church, refused to get to wed ourselves to just one of these associations as a denominational thing, because in the spirit of Congregationalism, we're like, no, we're an independent congregational church. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that and some of the history of this church, and then some of the history of theology, and exactly what Jeff said.
And we equally ignore all 3 of them, to be perfectly honest. So we're one of the ways that you show your association as being a part of their national meetings. It's also part of paying some dues to that, and we don't do either, and haven't well before me in terms of our leadership. So that's one of the things we are exploring, is how we might be rejoining some of those associations, and what that might bring to the life of this church, but also what we may be able to bring to that association as well. So we're exploring that. So good question. It's a question that often gets asked. Anyone else? A wondering that you're having, or something that's bubbling up? All right. Oh, yeah. Okay. And then I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Well, I guess I didn't have to spend half the night reading the Congregational Way because you all covered so much. No, seriously, this is Arthur Rauner's book that he wrote, one of his over 20 books that he wrote, called The Congregational Way. And I feel that this book covers a lot of what you've covered so far. And I believe it helps us to understand maybe this church and where we're going, the spirit of the church, the spirit of the people. I love this book. And so I would actually, Cynthia and I went down to the library to see if there were some copies down there. We couldn't find a copy, but maybe they're all checked out. I think so. But anyway, I highly recommend this book, The Congregational Way. You can get it online, right?
We used to make the confirmants read that book, ninth graders, and the parents would all have to sign a piece of paper saying that they witnessed the kids reading that book. Which I'm quite sure was not true on many occasions. Interesting enough, Arthur's father was very involved in the uniting of the congregational churches. Was very part of the big debate early in the 50s, late 40s and early 50s. And I've been around for 40 years, so I worked for Arthur. Arthur hired me when I first started. And that was the congregational understanding that we operated under his whole ministry. But every congregational pastor we've had since then had their own understanding of congregationalism. They would often even say, well, that's the way Arthur understood congregationalism. I mean, that was a quote from every pastor before me in terms of, and that's true congregationalism right there. It says, well, as we said early on, how are we going to operate as a congregation? And we're going to decide that as a congregation that's gathered at that point. Standing on tradition, standing on history, but figuring out how we're going to do that going forward. And that, I'll stop there because it's not my turn to speak about this. But I would say that is a really important concept and question for us to wrestle with, is what does it mean for us to be not only congregationalists, but what does it mean to be a part of this covenant community? And what decisions will we make that will guide us, again, respecting and honor who we have been and where we've been, but going forward, what will that look like, and how will we be formed around the best decisions we can make as a church going forward? You get the last question.
It's just a comment. I was interested to see the piece about radical social movements, and I will be curious to engage with that and what that means with Welcome Beloved in 2023. I didn't know that about the Congregationalist Church, so.
Thank you. I'll have you close us in prayer. So you actually are going to end. But before that, I just wanted to say again, thank you for being here and thank you for being church together. I think I identified most of you and put you in my little group to receive communication about this class. So I'll send you a follow-up with a PDF attachment from this class. Some of you have indicated that you're interested in exploring membership and you filled out the form saying that, but I don't know for sure. There may be some additional ones of you. I know some of you have been long-term members, but there may be some others who are considering membership. If you could either grab me after, just by saying hello, not physically, or send me an email. And then also, if you're with us online and you're wanting to be in the group, I obviously didn't know that you were here. Or if you have any friends or people you know who want to get info about it, just tell them to send me a note and I'll get them added to the group so they can get communication about this, okay? Thank you again for being here. Jeff, will you close us in prayer?
Absolutely. I would just add one last point that if something's bubbled up and you have a question or concern, we love those kinds of lunches and coffees where we can discuss more if there's some specific things that you'd like to bring to us or thoughts that you have or just something you'd like to wrestle with us with. We'd be glad to have those meetings with you. So grateful that you were here together. Aren't you glad that you are part of a church that has folks like Sarah and Christian as your leaders? I mean, they're pretty remarkable people, aren't they? Yeah. Let us pray. God, thank you for this special time tonight. Thanks for this chance for us to think about kind of who we are and where we've come from, and whether or not this makes sense for us, and what this following of this radical person Jesus is all about in this world today. So Lord, we pray that as we gather to learn and understand where we've been, that you will inform us of where you're calling us to be and to go next. So God, bless each one of these folks as they ponder these ideas that have been shared tonight, and for some of them ponder whether or not they want to join these ranks. And so God, I entrust them into your care and ask for a blessing upon them as they go until we meet together again. We pray this in your name. Amen. Take those notebooks with you, please, and bring them back next week.